The door to my bedroom had a new lock on it. Not the old brass knob I'd installed in 1997 after my wife insisted the hallway draft kept waking her at night. That knob had a tiny scratch shaped like a crescent moon where our son once crashed a toy truck into it. This one was different. Black, electronic, cold. And it wasn't opening. I stood there in the hallway with my suitcase still in my hand. 30 years as a doctor teaches you to notice small things. A slight tremor in a hand, the color shift in someone's lips, the quiet way people lie when they think you're too tired to question them. But I hadn't expected to practice those skills in my own house. The house on Hawthorne Street. The house my wife and I bought in 1992 for $168,000. Back when the neighborhood still smelled like fresh-cut lawns and barbecue smoke every Sunday afternoon. Now it smelled like lemon floor cleaner and someone else's perfume. From downstairs I heard laughter. My grandson's voice. The television. And then footsteps. My daughter-in-law, Melissa, appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She froze when she saw me. Not the warm kind of surprise. The calculating kind. "Oh, you're home early," she said. I checked my watch. 4:17 p.m. My flight from Seattle had landed 2 hours ahead of schedule. 30 years of hospital schedules makes you efficient with travel. Apparently, it also makes you unpredictable. "I live here," I said. My voice sounded calm, the way it does when delivering difficult diagnoses. She walked up the stairs slowly, holding a glass of iced coffee like it was part of a performance. When she reached me, she glanced at the door, then back at me, and she said something that, even now, still makes me smile. "Dad's room is gone." Gone. That was the exact word. Not changed. Not renovated. Not "we moved your things." Gone. I looked at the lock again. "Gone," I repeated. Melissa nodded like she was explaining something obvious. "Well, since you were traveling so much for that medical conference circuit, and the kids needed space, we turned it into the nursery." The nursery. My grandson was 8 years old. I blinked once. Doctors are trained not to react emotionally in front of patients. Turns out the skill works just as well with relatives. "So where are my things?" I asked. "Oh," she said quickly. "We packed everything carefully. Your clothes are in the guest closet. And the furniture, we moved some of it to storage. Some of it." My suitcase suddenly felt heavier. Behind Melissa, I heard my son's voice from downstairs. "Who's there?" She turned slightly and called down, "Your dad's back." A pause. Then footsteps. My son, David, came up the stairs with that familiar expression people get when they've been caught in a lie but are still deciding whether to deny it. He was 42 now. When he was 6, he once tried to convince me the dog had eaten an entire birthday cake. Same face. "Hey, Dad," he said carefully. "You got in early." I noticed. He glanced at the door too, then at Melissa, then at the floor. The silence stretched for a few seconds. I could hear the refrigerator humming downstairs. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Well, since you've been gone most of the year, we figured." I raised a hand. Not angrily, just enough to pause him. "Let me guess," I said. "You figured the room wasn't being used." Melissa nodded quickly. "Exactly." She smiled like she'd just solved a practical problem. "You know how tight space gets with kids." I looked down the hallway. The same hallway where my wife used to hang Christmas garlands every December. The same hallway where she once spilled an entire bowl of popcorn laughing during a movie night in 2008. She died 5 years ago. Heart failure. 72 years old. For 43 years that bedroom had been ours. And now it was a nursery. I did something that surprised them. I smiled. Not a big smile. Just the kind doctors give when a patient says something mildly ridiculous. "Well," I said, setting my suitcase down, "I suppose that happens." Melissa visibly relaxed. David too. People always relax when they think you've accepted something. "Exactly," Melissa said quickly. "It's temporary anyway." Temporary. Another interesting word. "Of course," I said. Then I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the guest room. Behind me I heard Melissa whisper something to David. Probably relief. Probably strategy. Either way, it didn't matter yet. The guest room used to be my office. Now my life fit inside 2 plastic storage bins and a closet rod. My suits were wrinkled. My wife's old jewelry box was missing. And the framed photograph from our 1979 honeymoon in Maine was gone. I sat on the bed. The mattress squeaked. Not the comfortable squeak of familiarity. The cheap squeak of something recently replaced. Downstairs, dinner plates clinked. The smell of pasta drifted up the stairs. For a moment I just sat there and breathed slowly. Doctors spend decades watching people at their worst moments. Anger is common. Panic too. But the people who survive disasters best are the ones who pause first. Observe. Collect information. Then act. So I stood up and opened the closet. Inside were the 2 bins. One labeled Dad Clothes. The other, Miscellaneous. Miscellaneous. 43 years of marriage reduced to miscellaneous. I chuckled softly. Interesting, I muttered. And yes, I actually sniffed the air like an old bloodhound. Call it professional habit. Hospitals teach you strange skills. And there it was. Fresh paint. New carpet glue. Someone had renovated my bedroom recently. Quickly. Quietly. Without telling me. Which meant this decision hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned. Carefully. Probably during the 6 weeks I'd been traveling for medical seminars in Chicago and Denver. That realization made something click quietly in my head. Not anger. Something colder. Curiosity. Later that night, after dinner, I walked past my old bedroom again. The door was closed. A small wooden sign hung on it now. Oliver's room. My grandson. I placed a hand on the door. The lock beeped red. Melissa's voice floated from the living room. Oh right, we changed the code system. Kids' safety. Of course. Safety. I nodded politely. Then I went back to the guest room and lay down. The ceiling fan ticked slowly. Tick, tick, tick. Around 2:40 a.m., I woke up. Doctors develop strange sleep patterns after decades of night shifts. I sat up and looked at the clock. The house was quiet. Perfectly quiet. I walked softly into the hallway. Moonlight from the window painted silver lines across the floor. And there it was again. That lock. Black. New. Confident. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I smiled again. Because Melissa had said something earlier that she probably didn't realize was important. Your furniture. We moved some of it to storage. Some. Which meant they had kept some things inside the room. Which meant they hadn't fully emptied it. Which meant they were hiding something. And after 30 years in medicine, I know one thing very well. When people hide something, they always assume the quiet old man won't notice. They are usually wrong. I went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. Instead, I planned. By morning, the house would still look the same. Breakfast would still happen. Melissa would still smile that careful smile. But somewhere between midnight and sunrise, the game had already started. And they had absolutely no idea. Breakfast in that house had always started the same way for decades. Coffee first. Then toast. Then the sound of my wife humming something from the 70s while she opened the kitchen window. The humming was gone now. But the rest of the routine still tried to pretend everything was normal. At 7:12 a.m., I walked into the kitchen. Melissa was standing at the counter slicing strawberries. My grandson Oliver sat at the table playing with a plastic dinosaur. David scrolled through his phone. No one mentioned the locked door. That told me everything. People who feel guilty avoid the subject like it's radioactive. Morning, I said. Melissa smiled brightly. Good morning. Coffee? Please. She handed me a mug. I sniffed it automatically. 30 years of hospital coffee had trained my nose. This one was stronger than usual. Interesting. Sleep well? David asked. Well enough, I said. I took a slow sip. Oliver suddenly looked up. Grandpa, my room has a robot lock. Melissa's knife stopped moving. David cleared his throat. Oh yeah, he said quickly. High tech. Oliver grinned. It lights up blue. Blue. I nodded thoughtfully. Impressive. Melissa forced a laugh. Kids love gadgets. I finished my coffee. Where'd you? Doctors recognize reflex lies the way musicians recognize wrong notes. So I nodded politely. Good choice. After breakfast, David left for work at 8:03 a.m. Melissa took Oliver to school. The house went quiet. That's when the real morning began. I walked straight to the hallway and examined the lock. Electronic keypad. Fingerprint reader. Brand name, Cavotec. Retail price, about $320. Installation time, roughly 40 minutes if you know what you're doing. But the screws were perfectly aligned, which meant one of two things. Either Melissa had secretly developed professional locksmith skills, or someone else had installed it. I crouched down and studied the door frame. Fresh drill dust had been cleaned, but not perfectly. There was a thin white line of plaster near the hinge. That told me the installation had happened less than 2 weeks ago. I smiled again. Timing is everything. Back in the guest room, I opened the bin labeled miscellaneous. Inside were photo albums, old medical journals, and a small envelope containing receipts. Receipts I didn't recognize. One stood out immediately. Brightstone Storage, Unit 214. Monthly fee, $185. Start date, 5 weeks ago. That was curious. I hadn't authorized any storage unit, which meant someone had used my belongings to justify renting space. Or they had moved something out of my room, something they didn't want me to see. My pulse didn't rise. Doctors learn to stay calm when evidence begins to appear. Instead, I grabbed my car keys. Brightstone Storage sat 12 minutes away, near the interstate. Rows of metal doors baked in the morning sun. Unit 214 was halfway down the third row. The lock looked new. I stood there for a moment thinking, technically I didn't have the key, but legally, those were my belongings. And sometimes, after decades in hospitals, you become friends with people who know useful things. So I made a call. Frank, I said when he answered. Frank Donovan had been my patient 8 years ago after a motorcycle accident. These days he owned a security company. Doc, haven't heard from you in months. I need a small favor. He chuckled. Door problem. You could say that. 40 minutes later, Frank arrived with a small toolkit and the relaxed confidence of a man who had opened many locks in his life. He studied the storage unit. Family drama? He asked. I sniffed. Something like that. He knelt down and worked quietly for about 18 seconds. Click. The door rolled up with a metallic rattle. Inside were my things. My dresser. My wife's old rocking chair. 2 boxes labeled Dad Files. And one item that made Frank whistle softly. A safe. Large. Steel. The one that used to sit in the corner of my bedroom. The safe containing documents, savings bonds, and the original deed to the house. Frank looked at me. Doc, why would someone move this out of your house? Good question. I stepped forward and wiped dust from the keypad. Someone had tried opening it several times. The metal showed faint scratch marks. Frank leaned closer. Looks like someone tried to force it. I chuckled quietly. Bad idea. The safe required 2 codes and a key. Only my wife and I had known them. And now, only me. I entered the code. The door opened smoothly. Inside, everything looked untouched. Property deed. Bank documents. Insurance policies. But something else caught my eye. A folded piece of paper. Not mine. I opened it. Frank watched silently. The paper contained a printed email. Subject line. Home transfer discussion. My son's name. Melissa's name. And a real estate agent. The message was short. Once the father moves permanently into assisted living, we can begin the title transfer process. Frank raised his eyebrows. Well, he muttered. That's ambitious. I felt something shift inside my chest. Not pain, just clarity. Assisted living. That was their plan. Step 1, remove my room. Step 2, isolate my belongings. Step 3, convince everyone the old man was ready to move somewhere. Quieter. Then they would take the house. Simple, efficient, and incredibly stupid, because they had made one mistake. They assumed the quiet old doctor was finished thinking. Frank closed the safe again. "What's the move?" he asked. I thought for a moment. Then I laughed softly. A strange little laugh doctors sometimes develop after midnight shifts. "Frank," I said, "do you know any good lawyers?" He grinned. "Oh, Doc, I know exactly the right one." That afternoon at 2:30 p.m., I sat across from Angela Martinez, an estate attorney who had the calm eyes of someone who had seen every kind of family disaster imaginable. She listened quietly while I explained everything. The lock, the storage unit, the email. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said, "they're not very subtle."
No.
She tapped the desk thoughtfully. "The house is still legally yours?" "Completely." She smiled slightly. "Then this situation is fixable." I felt the first real sense of relief all day. "What do you recommend?" Angela opened a folder and slid a sheet of paper toward me. "A strategy. Simple, legal, and devastating." That night I returned home. Dinner was quiet again. Melissa chatted about school schedules. David talked about work. No one mentioned the storage unit. No one asked what I'd done all day, which meant they assumed I was still confused, still passive, still harmless. Around 9:40 p.m., Melissa said something interesting. "We were thinking maybe it's time to look at some senior communities," she said gently. David nodded. "Places with medical care, activities." I looked up slowly. "Oh," Melissa smiled sweetly. "You deserve comfort." Comfort. That word again. I smiled back. "Thank you," I said. Then I added something very small. "Actually, I've been thinking about changes too." David looked relieved. Melissa practically sparkled. "Oh, yes," I said. "A few changes." And then I went upstairs, past the hallway, past the locked door, into the guest room, where I sat at the small desk and began writing something carefully. A letter. Not long, just precise. By the time I finished, the clock read 12:08 a.m. I folded the paper slowly and smiled, because by dawn, everything in that house would change. At 5:11 a.m., the house was silent, the kind of silence that only exists before sunrise. No television, no coffee maker, just the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the soft ticking of the hallway clock. I sat at the small desk in the guest room, looking at the envelope I had finished the night before. My handwriting had always been neat. Years of filling out medical charts will do that. Precise, controlled, hard to misinterpret. The letter lay there quietly, like a scalpel before surgery. And that was exactly what this was. Surgery. Not emotional. Clinical. I stood up and stretched. 30 years of hospital work teaches you another strange habit. Functioning perfectly on 4 hours of sleep. I stepped into the hallway. The moonlight had faded. A faint gray morning light crept through the window. And there it was again. The door. My door. Still wearing its shiny black lock like a badge of victory. I walked over and ran a finger lightly across the keypad. Cold plastic. Melissa had been proud of this little machine. Technology always gives people a false sense of power. I chuckled softly. Then I went downstairs. At 5:26 a.m., my phone buzzed. "Angela, everything ready?" she asked. "Yes. And you're certain you want to do this today?" "I've had 5 years to think about patience," I said. She laughed quietly. "Fair point. Your team. Already moving. Perfect." At 6:02 a.m., the first knock came at the front door. Not loud, just firm. I opened it to find 2 men in dark jackets carrying tool bags. Frank's people. "Morning, Doc," one of them said. "Morning." They stepped inside quickly. One of them walked straight to the hallway and studied the electronic lock. "Cheap model," he muttered. "How long?" I asked. He pulled out a small screwdriver. 30 seconds. I leaned against the wall and folded my arms. Behind us the house remained quiet. Upstairs, Melissa and David were still asleep. The technician removed the front panel of the lock. Wires. Circuit board. Tiny battery pack. He smiled. "Yep." Click. The lock blinked once. then went dark. He pulled the entire unit off the door. Procedures matter. Angela glanced around the house calmly. Everyone still asleep? For now. She nodded. Good. The deputy leaned against the wall. Just here to observe, he said. Appreciated. Angela opened her folder. Inside were documents neatly stacked. Legal documents. The kind that change people's lives quietly but permanently. I took the envelope from my pocket and placed it on the hallway table. Ready, I said. At 6:41 a.m., Melissa came downstairs. She was still wearing a robe, half asleep, carrying her phone. Then she froze, because the hallway was full of strangers. Angela, the deputy, 2 technicians, and me, standing beside my open bedroom door. Melissa blinked. Once, twice. What is going on? Her eyes dropped to the door. The lock was gone. Completely gone. Her face turned pale. Where's the lock? She whispered. I sniffed the air thoughtfully. Oh, I said. That thing. Angela stepped forward politely. Good morning. Angela Martinez, estate attorney. Melissa stared at her, then at the deputy, then at me. David's voice came from upstairs. Melissa. Footsteps. He appeared at the top of the staircase, then stopped when he saw the scene below. Dad. I smiled gently. Morning. David's eyes moved to the open bedroom door, the removed lock sitting on the hallway table, then to the sheriff's badge. His face lost color. Angela cleared her throat. Mr. David Harper and Mrs. Melissa Harper, she said calmly. This is a formal notification regarding property access and legal occupancy. Melissa looked like someone had unplugged her brain. What? Angela handed her a document. Please read. Melissa's hands shook as she took the paper. I watched quietly. Doctors get very used to watching people process bad news. It usually happens in stages. Confusion, denial, fear. Melissa reached stage 2 immediately. This is ridiculous, she snapped. David grabbed the paper and read it quickly. Then again. Slower. Angela spoke softly. The house at 214 Hawthorne Street remains the sole legal property of Dr. Harper. David swallowed. We know that. Angela nodded. However, the new legal filing submitted yesterday establishes a private residential trust. She slid another document across the table. The property has now been transferred into that trust. Melissa looked up. So? Angela smiled politely. So the trust has new residency terms. The hallway went very quiet. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to pause. David read further. His lips moved silently across the page. Then he whispered something. No. Angela continued calmly. Under the updated terms, only registered residents listed within the trust agreement may occupy the property. Melissa's voice cracked. And who's listed? Angela looked at me. I shrugged slightly. Then she answered. Dr. Harper. Melissa's face drained of color completely. David stared at the page like it had bitten him. What about us? He asked slowly. Angela folded her hands. You are currently classified as temporary occupants. The deputy shifted slightly beside the wall. Melissa's voice rose sharply. This is insane. Angela didn't react. Under the notice terms, temporary occupants have 30 days to vacate the premises. Silence. Heavy. Dense. Melissa's hands trembled visibly. And then she saw the envelope on the hallway table. My letter. Her eyes flicked toward me. What's that? I picked it up slowly. Oh, I said casually. This. I handed it to her. For you. She opened it with shaking fingers. David leaned over her shoulder. They both read silently. The letter was short. Very short. Just 6 lines. Their eyes moved across the page. And that's when Melissa's hands began to tremble even harder. Because the last line said something very simple. Something that made the entire hallway feel colder. And for the record, the house was never the inheritance you thought it was. Melissa looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. What does that mean? I smiled softly. 30 years of medicine had taught me a strange truth about revenge. It doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes the quietest truths hurt the most. Well, I said gently, that's a longer story. And David realized something terrible in that moment. The plan they had spent weeks preparing had already collapsed before they even knew the game had started. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hallway had that strange stillness that happens after someone hears news they didn't prepare for. Melissa was still holding the letter. Her fingers were shaking so badly the paper rustled like dry leaves. David read the final line again and again. His lips moved slowly. The house was never the inheritance you thought it was. He looked up at me. What does that mean, Dad? His voice sounded smaller than I'd heard it in years. I leaned lightly against the wall. Well, I said calmly, it means exactly what it says. Melissa's voice cracked. You can't just. Angela raised a gentle hand. Mrs. Harper, please. The deputy shifted slightly beside the stairs. Not threatening, just present. A reminder that the morning had become official. Melissa swallowed hard. What inheritance? She demanded. Her voice was louder now, a little desperate. I watched them carefully. Doctors spend decades reading faces during difficult conversations. And right now both of them looked like patients waiting for a diagnosis they already suspected. So I gave them the truth. Slowly. 5 years ago, I said, when your mother died. David flinched slightly. I updated my estate planning. Melissa blinked. You told us the house would go to David. I said the house would stay in the family. There's a difference. Angela slid another document onto the table. Dr. Harper established a charitable residential trust. Melissa frowned. A what? Angela explained patiently. The property is now owned by a trust that provides housing for retired medical workers with limited income. David stared at her. You're kidding.
No.
She tapped the paper. The home will become part of a rotating housing program beginning next year. Melissa's voice rose. You're giving the house away? I shrugged. Not exactly. David's forehead creased. What does that mean? I smiled slightly. Well, the trust allows me to live here for the rest of my life. Angela nodded. And after that, she said calmly, the property is transferred permanently to the program. David leaned back against the stair rail like someone had punched him. So, we get nothing? I sniffed thoughtfully. Well, technically you received something. Melissa's head snapped toward me. What? 30 days. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Melissa's eyes were wide. David looked stunned. And for the first time since I walked into that hallway yesterday afternoon, they realized something important. They had miscalculated. Badly. Melissa suddenly laughed. But it wasn't a happy laugh. You're bluffing. Angela turned the folder toward her. Here are the file documents from yesterday afternoon at 2:54 p.m. Melissa stared down at them. Legal stamps. County signatures. Everything official. Her face drained of color again. David rubbed his forehead. You did this? Because of the bedroom? I chuckled softly. Oh no. I glanced toward the open doorway of the room they'd tried to take. This was done months ago. David blinked. What? After your mother died, I said quietly. I spent a lot of time thinking about what houses do to families. Melissa scoffed. That's ridiculous. Is it? I gestured toward the hallway. You installed a lock on my bedroom. Neither of them answered. You moved my belongings into a storage unit. David looked down. And you contacted a real estate agent about transferring ownership after sending me to assisted living. Melissa's head jerked upward. How did you? I tapped the letter she still held. You left the email in my safe. That was the moment their confidence fully collapsed. Melissa's shoulders slumped. David closed his eyes. For a long time no one spoke. Even Angela stayed quiet. Sometimes silence does the work better than words. Finally David whispered something. I thought. You were gone so much. I was working. I thought maybe you were ready to slow down. I smiled gently. I am. Melissa shook her head. This is insane. No, Angela said calmly. This is legal. Melissa suddenly slammed the letter onto the table. Melissa opened her mouth, closed it again. David stared at the floor. The deputy quietly checked his watch. Angela adjusted the folder, and the morning sunlight slowly crept through the hallway window. At 7:14 a.m., Oliver came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes. "Mom!" Melissa wiped her face quickly. David forced a weak smile. "Hey, buddy." Oliver looked around the hallway. "Why are there so many people here?" "Children notice everything." He pointed at the removed lock on the table. "Where's my robot door?" I crouched slightly. "Well," I said gently, "that door belonged to Grandpa." Oliver nodded thoughtfully. "Okay." Then he asked something that made everyone else in the room uncomfortable. "So, where are we going?" Melissa didn't answer. David didn't answer. Angela didn't answer. But the truth hung in the air anyway. Because sometimes the hardest consequence of a plan is simply watching it fall apart in front of a child. I stood up slowly. "Oliver," I said, "why don't you go eat some cereal?" He shrugged and walked into the kitchen. Kids adapt quickly. Adults struggle. Melissa finally spoke again. Her voice was smaller now. "What do you want from us?" I thought about that for a moment. 30 years of medicine had shown me how often people ask the wrong question. So I answered honestly, "Nothing." David looked up. "Then why do this?" I smiled softly. "Because sometimes the truth is simpler than people expect." "Because," I said quietly, "a house is just wood and drywall." I tapped the hallway wall lightly. "But respect." I looked directly at both of them. "That's harder to rebuild once you tear it down." Angela closed the folder. "The 30-day notice begins today." The deputy nodded. Procedures completed. Frank's technicians gathered their tools and headed toward the door. One of them gave me a small nod as he passed. "Good luck, document." "Thank you." The house slowly emptied again, until only the three of us stood in the hallway. Me, my son, my daughter-in-law, and the open door of the bedroom they tried to erase. David finally spoke. "What happens now?" I looked into the room. The sunlight was touching the floorboards where my wife's rocking chair used to sit. "Now," I said gently, "life continues." And strangely enough, for the first time since I came home yesterday, the house finally felt quiet again. The house felt different after that morning. Not louder, not quieter, just honest. For the next few days, David and Melissa moved around the place like guests who weren't sure how long they were allowed to stay, which technically was accurate. 30 days. Angela had made that part very clear. On the second evening after everything happened, I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of tea. The same porch where my wife and I used to watch thunderstorms roll in from the west. The wooden railing still had a small burn mark from the summer of 2003, when I dropped a cigar during a 4th of July barbecue. I ran my finger over that mark and smiled. Memories are funny things. They attach themselves to the smallest details. The back door opened quietly. David stepped outside. He stood there for a moment before speaking. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course." He lowered himself into the chair across from me. For a long time we just listened to the evening insects. Finally he sighed. "I messed up. It wasn't dramatic. Just honest." I nodded. "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Melissa thought you were drifting away from the house." "I was traveling." "I know." He stared out at the yard. "When Mom died, everything felt unstable." I said nothing. People sometimes need silence more than advice. He continued. "We thought maybe, if we secured the house, things would feel safe again." I sniffed lightly. A curious way to create safety. He winced. "Yeah." After a moment he asked the question he'd probably been carrying all week. "Did you ever plan to leave the house to me?" I looked out across the backyard. The maple tree my wife planted in 1988 was taller now than the roofline. "I planned to leave you something better." David frowned slightly. "What?" "A chance to build your own life." He stared at me. "That sounds like a lecture." I chuckled. "Occupational hazard." 30 years of medicine turns every conversation into a diagnosis eventually. He leaned back in the chair. I keep thinking about the lock. The robot door? He laughed weakly. Yeah. I sniffed the air dramatically. Terrible brand. That made him laugh a little harder. The tension loosened slightly. Dark humor has its uses. A week passed. Then two. Melissa slowly stopped avoiding me in the kitchen. David found a small apartment across town. Oliver mostly seemed confused about why the robot door had disappeared. Kids adapt faster than adults. By the third week, boxes started appearing near the front hallway. Life was moving again, just in a different direction. On the final morning, David stood by the front door with the last suitcase. Melissa held Oliver's hand. The hallway looked much emptier now. Melissa cleared her throat. I misjudged you. I nodded. That happens. She hesitated. Thank you for the 30 days. Angela had advised that number very carefully. Not cruel. Not generous. Just fair. Oliver suddenly ran over and hugged my leg. Bye, Grandpa. Patted his head. Take care of your parents. He grinned. I will. Kids say things like that without irony. It's one of their best qualities. When the door finally closed behind them, the house fell silent again. But this time it felt peaceful. Not lonely, just quiet. I walked down the hallway slowly. The bedroom door stood open. No locks, no gadgets, just wood and hinges, the way it had been for decades. A few weeks later, Frank helped bring my furniture back from the storage unit. My wife's rocking chair went back into its old corner. The safe returned to its place beside the closet. And the photograph from our 1979 honeymoon in Maine sat once again on the dresser. The room looked familiar again, but not identical. Some things had changed, and that was all right. 6 months later, the first retired nurse moved into the small guest room downstairs. Her name was Carol. She had worked night shifts for 42 years. The trust program had finally begun. The house felt alive again, not with family arguments, but with quiet purpose. One evening Carol asked me a question while we were drinking tea in the kitchen. Do you ever regret giving the house away? I sniffed thoughtfully. Not really. She tilted her head. Why not? I smiled. Because the truth had become very simple. Revenge, I said slowly, isn't about hurting people. Carol raised an eyebrow. No. I shook my head. It's about protecting what matters before someone else breaks it. She nodded slowly. That answer seemed to satisfy her. Sometimes I still walk down the hallway at night. Old habits from decades of hospital shifts. The floorboards creak softly under my feet. The bedroom door opens easily. No locks, no codes. Just a quiet room filled with memories. And when I stand there in the doorway, I sometimes chuckle to myself. Because the funniest part of the entire story is something Melissa never understood. The house was never the real treasure. Peace was. And that is something no one can lock away.